Historian with social justice organizer and author of a book, Deep Denial, The Persistence of White Supremacy in History, whoops, I just lost it, in History and Life. DeepDenialBook.com is the website. You can tweet him at UMChurch. Reverend David Billings, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. I find your book fascinating, and particularly You've got to turn that volume down somehow. But in any case, I found your book fascinating, particularly the part about where you talk about, growing up white in the South. Can we define terms to start out? How would you define white supremacy?
I would think that white supremacy has to do with the structures and institutions that support and affirm the lives of white people in the United States. White supremacy covers, all institutional interactions as well as economics and other types of things. But white supremacy is the rarely challenged, rarely even mentioned as a factor in this society, and yet it permeates the nation's history.
To what extent you're describing white supremacy as something that is there for white people. In other words, arguably, using the word positive in this context is very difficult, but I don't know how else to say it. You're defining it as a support system for white people. But isn't it also at the same time a destruction system or an oppression system for people of color?
Absolutely it is. And, it impacts everyone of color in this country and, certainly black and brown.
So, who are the white supremacists, to paraphrase a question the New York Times asked Henry Wallace in 1944, who are the white supremacists that we should be concerned about? Are they the people like Richard Spencer who are obvious and out there and saying it? Or is it the person who lives next door who is just constantly dropping, microaggressions on people and or making hiring decisions at work that are not visible to the world at large, but are supporting the infrastructure of white supremacy?
It's all of those, but I think white supremacy really is upheld by those of us in the professions, those of us who even would decry white supremacy and say, I certainly don't agree with the Spencers of the world, but don't do anything about it. We just, decry racism and white supremacy, say we're against it, it's abhorrent, but we don't organize to do anything about it for the most part. And a lot of us, as the title of my book suggests, we're just in denial about the impact of race and white supremacy in this society. And we're encouraged to be in denial by all the institutions of society. Thus, we take no responsibility for the outcomes in this society. And those of us who are white, we're uneducated around race and white supremacy. We don't have to study it. It's always an elective. It's never a requirement.
Which is one of the principal benefits of white privilege, is it not?
Oh, yes.
White people don't have to bother with this.
And because we don't understand it, we just have an opinion on it.
Right.
And opinions, can be many and varied. And I think there's an intent to that throughout the history of this country.
So clearly we've had institutions of white supremacy in the United States, government institutions of white supremacy. We have business institutions of white supremacy. I'm thinking, redlining by the banks, for example, with real estate. Mm-hmm. But there's a million smaller examples. What are the institutions of white supremacy that in the past we have taken apart? And what are the institutions of white supremacy that in the present we need to have a discussion about taking apart?
Well, yes, the fact that none of our institutions see race as just one among many factors in this society, and when you do that, you dilute the impact of race, in my opinion. We put racism on a line with other oppressions, but this is a race-constructed nation. That's one thing. Now, currently, it's the dismissal. And the black voice, I think, as your previous discussion was going, it dilutes the power, say, of Black Lives Matter. It dilutes the meaning of the violence that has occurred so often in this country of late, and as you know, as just an aberration, when in fact it's yet another example of how this country and its white people, not just its majority, but it's all of us who are white. We try not to face the realities of racism, and even, as I said, deny that it exists in some quarters. But that's not just conservatives or haters or whatever language you use. It goes to the very heart of the systems and their history and why they were created that still create our realities today.
Yeah. Would you say that, for example, the attempts to limit the ability of people to vote by requiring them to produce, a birth certificate or a passport in order to register to vote,
Yes.
Is that an institution of white supremacy?
It is, and throughout this nation, as blacks and people of color got the right to vote, this nation would try to limit that, whether it's in the immediate aftermath of civil rights or towards the end of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century. The exercise of the right to vote, suffrage, has been fought every step of the way, still being fought today, so that efforts to limit the impact and limit the understanding of those of us who are white we don't understand the dramatic efforts that are put
right
towards limiting the voice of people of color.
Reverend Billings, we have just a minute left. We're talking with Reverend David Billings, the author of Deep Denial, The Persistence of White Supremacy in U.S. History and Life. What can white people do to wake up from their own denial?
I think we have to study. We're ignorant on the matter of race. We have to know that, like anything else, it has a beginning and it has impact. We have to study that. We have to join with other whites to gain clarity about what racism truly is. It's not, just or even primarily is it attitudinal or even acts of meanness. It's an arrangement. It's a structure that goes back to the very foundings of the nation. Now, a lot of us don't know that. Many of us do. The question is, what are we going, how do we act, how do we organize in our churches, in our universities, and in the larger economy? How do we organize to impact this arrangement that brushes aside, basically, the voice of people of color?
Yeah. Well, step one is calling it out, which seems like you're doing a brilliant job of. Reverend David Billings, native of Mississippi, pastor in the United Methodist Church, historian, social justice organizer, and the author of the new book, Deep Denial, The Persistence of White Supremacy in History and Life. DeepDenialBook.com is the website. Reverend Billings, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Great speaking with you. We'll be back.